Welcome to the afternoon session. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. We have 2 of our 3 panelists, so I think we have a quorum to start. Let me introduce the 3 panelists. The first is Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles. She's a graduate of the Consortium Graduate School, Mona, Jamaica. She served as Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences from 1994 to 1996 at Cave Hill, and is a former head of the Department of Government, Sociology and Social Work at the Cave Hill campus, 2004 to 2006. She has published in the areas of Caribbean international relations, general elections, and voting in the Caribbean. She has also published on Caribbean sovereignty, regional integration, governance, political party financing in the Commonwealth Caribbean, and women and political participation in the region. She has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited a number of books and articles. In 2005 and 10, she was a member of the Commonwealth Office expert team monitoring the Sri Lankan presidential election. And in 2008-2009, she also served as a member of the Commonwealth Observer Mission for the December 7th and 28th, 2008 parliamentary and presidential elections and runoff presidential elections, as well as the Ghana presidential and parliamentary elections, December 2012. She has also participated in a number of OAS election monitoring teams in the Caribbean. She served as a member of the St. Lucia Constitution Reform Commission and is currently a member of the International Advisory Board for the journal Roundtable. She is also a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Eastern Caribbean Affairs and is a member of the CSA executive. The second presenter isn't here, but I'll take Professor Clifford Griffin, who is here. He's Associate Professor of Political Science, School of Public and International Affairs, North Carolina State University. He has had more than 25 years of research, teaching, commenting, and consulting on all aspects of Caribbean political economy, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and crime, both national and transnational, migration, legal and illegal, and trade and development. He's author of 2 books and is writing the first book on U.S.-Caribbean relations. He's a contributing editor to the Handbook of Latin American Studies, Library of Congress, and contributing editor of ARA, Journal of Tourism Research. He's also International Programs Director and directs the Hanzhou China International Relations Mechanical Engineering Chinese Language History Summer Study Program, Abroad Program. And our second panelist has arrived, so I can present him. He is Professor Trevor Munroe, currently visiting honorary professor at UWI Mona at SALISES. He received his early education at St. George's College, graduated with first-class honors in government from the UWI, and received his doctorate in political science from Oxford University, which he attended as a Jamaican Rhodes Scholar. During a scholarly career which extended from teaching assistant to professor of government and politics and spanned 40 years in the Mona campus Faculty of Social Sciences, Dr. Munroe authored or co-authored 9 academic books and numerous publications on governance. Among Professor Munroe's academic and professional awards are the UWI Vice Chancellor Award for Excellence, Mona Campus Principal Award for Research, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the UWI Press, 2 Fulbright Fellowships at Harvard University, and the Honorary Doctorate in Social Sciences from Florida International University. He was also founding director of the UWI Mona Center for Leadership and Governance. As a public intellectual, Dr. Munroe served for 10 years as a senator in the Jamaican Parliament, co-hosted award-winning current development radio programs, founded, co-founded, a number of civil society organizations, including Citizens Action for Free and Fair Elections, CAFE, the Jamaican Election Monitoring Organizations, the University and Allied Workers Union, one of Jamaica's leading trade unions, and finally National Integrity Action. He has served as consultant to national and international organizations, including the World Bank, the OAS, the Carter Center, USAID, and DFID UK. So that's the part that Trevor wants to make public. I won't speak to the other distinguished components, but you can question him afterwards. So let me proceed by asking Dr. Cynthia Barrow-Giles to lead off, and then the other panelists will follow in turn.
Thank you, Rupert. Before I start, I want to thank Brian and the rest of the team, Kit in particular, for inviting me to participate in this year's, in this second or third conference on Westminster in the Caribbean. As usual, just again to get the record straight, let me just say, first of all, I'm not a professor, unless we're talking about the American political system, where I do not work. And secondly, I'm not a doctor as well, so 2 corrections. I don't want to be, I don't want to have to account for having said I'm a doctor or a professor. I know certain people in St. Lucia who lost their job, political, for pretending that they were doctors, and I make no such pretense. All right, having said that, this morning we heard from the Minister, Peter Phillips, who happened to have been my supervisor at the Consortium Graduate Studies, School of Studies. So, now, there's something, having listened to Peter, there's clearly something in common with some of the things, the ideas he presented this morning, and it's captured in my paper. We didn't there was no collusion between the 2 of us, but there's a strong, trend running through his paper that I also picked up in my paper. My paper is entitled, and it's something I'm working with, Good Governance of Penance, Enhancing Westminster in the Caribbean. And essentially, what I do is to look at Westminster in the context of, first, a discussion of what democracy today means, and then I look at just two of the institutional practices in the Caribbean, which I'm arguing can, in fact, minimize participation in critical decision-making. And so what I try to do is to look at those 2 institutional practices, make some recommendations the way forward to see to what extent we can improve the Westminster Westminster model in the Caribbean. Now, in terms of my definition of democracy today, it's really rooted in our understanding of what is, of course, representative democracy. And basically what I'm arguing, and I don't want to go through all of it, is that democracy today is really achieved via the control of citizens over their representatives. So I'm arguing that the extent to which that control is achieved and the equality of the control exercised by citizens are both crucial elements of representative democracy as we practice it today, certainly in Westminster politics. What I'm arguing is that, for the most part, the electoral systems are critical determinants of the exercise of such control and the exercise of power. The second component of democracy is the accountability of governmental institutions and public officials to the electorate, whether it is directly or indirectly. And that is done, of course, through Parliament and other oversight mechanisms, such as a judiciary. Now, I am not going to make any pretense, as I said a while ago, to dealing with all of the myriad problems confronting Westminster in the Caribbean. And we heard some this morning, but of course it was not exclusive. Rather, as I said a while ago, I'm focusing on what is seen as the 2 institutional practices that have, in fact, in the past, minimized and continues to minimize participation in our decision-making process. It's also, of course, limited the overall quality of representation and have frustrated consensual decision-making. Now, I am not going to pay much attention to the overall performance of the electoral system. Well, I'm paying a lot of attention to the overall performance of the electoral system in the region. And I do accept the viewpoint that in its present form, the model does little to enhance representation and therefore what I argue, good governance. The paper will address one other issue. I actually started off by saying I would focus on 3 issues when I started to write the paper. But then I got tired, and so I truncated it to 2 issues. I got really tired. And so it is really on the second issue has been variously considered by constitution reform commissions which is seen by me as a very rich source of primary data for analysis. And so my discussion today would really treat the very nature of parliamentarism, and I do that very briefly because most of my time is really spent on discussing the electoral system and elections in the Caribbean. And the reason, of course, why I felt it was necessary to look at the very nature of parliamentarism, it is because it has, as we heard this morning, intrinsic value, or, as some would argue, the lack of value to the region. And one of the reasons why it lacks some value or validity is because there is a tendency to restrain there's a tendency to restrain parliamentarians, where I'm arguing perhaps what is really required is greater cohabitation or cooperation. Unfortunately, we don't have that in the Caribbean. Now, my starting point, of course, is a little article that was published by the University of Guyana about nearly 20 years ago, I think it was 1995. And in the journal, I think it's Transition, which is published by the University of Guyana, Harold Lutchman published an article entitled The Westminster System in the Commonwealth of Caribbean, Some Issues and Problems. I've had the occasion to return to that article, which I find really covers and addresses most of the many problems that we have all identified as being key to the problems, to the issues confronting Westminster. So I'm arguing in the paper that the many issues which reflected upon in 1995 continue to characterize and have proven to be so culturally acceptable that some 20 years later, that is in 2014, we have been unable or unwilling to transcend them. Now, Lutchman considered that the states of the Commonwealth of Caribbean did in fact enjoy apparent efficiency, and they in fact are generally numbered among the most successful in achieving satisfactory results. Nonetheless, when you read Lutchman's paper, he's very clear that the framers of our Constitution had clearly not anticipated a number of problems which had and continue to manifest themselves shortly after independence. Now, according to Lutchman, notwithstanding these unanticipated difficulties of Westminster in the Caribbean, the model has in fact enjoyed widespread support, which has allowed several Commonwealth Caribbean states to survive what he describes as sudden and sometimes dramatic changes. He, however, concluded that elements of the Westminster system have come under critical scrutiny regarding the suitability for the region. Now, there are a number of other people who have echoed those basic sentiments, and among them we have Selwyn Ryan, who is with us today, and of course I think most of us in the room who study Westminster model, politics and certainly governance in the region would be familiar with his work, Winner Takes All. And of course you have people like Anthony Payne, Francis Alexis, and a whole range of persons who have commented on Westminster model in the region. Closer to this conference, nearly 10 years later, in 2003, we have Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barrow-Giles, pointing to the difficulties of Westminster parliamentary democracy in the Caribbean. And in fact, he reminded us in 2003 of its many limitations. These limitations, according to Barrow-Giles, which others have also echoed, is that an externally located head of state, an insufficiently strong enforcement of the protective provisions regarding individual rights and freedoms, a first-past-the-post electoral system which, according to Gonzalez, does not permit a sufficiently fair and democratic representation of voters' preferences, the absence of any proper mechanisms for voters to bring their elected representatives to account during the term of office, the highly inadequate and ineffective control which the legislative branch exercises over the executive, the excessive powers of the Prime Minister in both the constitutional and political apparatuses, and the lack of an appropriate mechanism for voters and non-governmental organizations to routinely and consistently participate in the governance of the country. He also spoke about what the unacceptable interference of the executive into the practical workings of the judiciary, and the absence or inadequacy of the constitutional provisions governing or regulating the integrity of members of the legislature and other public officials. Now, Gonzalez, in that work in 2003, also noted that these weaknesses can be remedied by a package of reasonable, what he described as reasonable constitutional arrangements. He also echoed those sentiments at the time when the constitution reform process in St. Vincent was underway, which should rest on the foundation stones of a strengthening of individual rights and freedoms, the deepening and decentralization of political democracy, the strengthening of representative democracy, of representative democracy, and accountable and effective government, and the independence of the judiciary. Now, I go on in the paper to look at what I call electoral triumphalism as a critical governance issue, and I want to look at the political effects of Westminster elections, and I spent some time looking at that. There are a number of people who have, in fact, pointed to the problems of the electoral model that we use, although, of course, some persons have argued that despite its many failings, West Indian political systems, and certainly West Indian political systems, have provided Caribbean societies with regular, usually honest, and basically reliable mechanisms for elite recruitment, and the emphasis on elite recruitment and circulation. Now, it is debatable that the main political issue is with the institutions of elections, given the number of persons who have proposed a change to the presidential form as a way of reducing the institutional limitations of Westminster. Nonetheless, we can argue that much of the discontent with constitutionalism in the West Indies stems from deficiencies in the electoral system, which we use, and not necessarily in the nature of parliamentarism or political pluralism. It is these deficiencies in the electoral system that, in some persons' view, can lead to the erosion of Westminster parliamentary systems, despite what some consider to be the intrinsic legitimacy of the model throughout the region. Now, a close look at the modern political system of the Commonwealth of the Caribbean, and we heard a lot about that this morning, so I don't want to go through it, is that, of course, it's derived from the Westminster model of parliamentary democracy, which is firmly rooted in single-member districts with plurality or majority electoral formulas. Now, the second major feature of our democracies is the domination of the political process by two major political parties. The latter is one of the most remarkable features of Commonwealth Caribbean politics, for when we compare the Caribbean to political democracies in other parts of the developing world, only two, and essentially the same two political parties, have controlled elections and thus governments in most states for an extensive period of time. Now, this is particularly true for Barbados and Jamaica, and of course we are saying, I'm arguing that third-party challenges have occurred, but when they have occurred, they have only on a rare occasion disrupted the system, and in some countries, in a country like Dominica, for example, we have such a disruption taking place in 1990, and then again in 1995. In the case of Dominica, you have a challenge posed by the Dominica United Workers' Party in the 1990s, which led to what appears to be an enduring organization, which has replaced the Dominica Freedom Party as a second major political organization in that country. Now, when we look at the election results in the Caribbean, as this table will show, I tried, but I had it on 3 slides, is that we have a situation where one party has dominated the electoral landscape and or parliament for extended periods of time. Now, this has occurred largely for 2 reasons. The first relates to the ability of the party to win the geographic race in every constituency or an overwhelming majority of those constituencies, leading to the domination of parliament by one party. In that regard, both St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 1989, Grenada in 1999, and in 2013, you have one party actually enjoying a clean sweep, thereby totally excluding opposition from parliament. Secondly, as in the case of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, in 1983 and 1971 respectively, the effective boycott of the elections by the opposition groups also resulted in a single-party hegemony in parliament. So that when we look at the table, what we'll see is that the frequency within which opposition voices are either silenced or marginalized across the region, there is that frequency, with a tendency for that to be accentuated in countries like Antigua and Barbuda, and which has in fact witnessed such domination in 5 of the 7 general elections held in that country since independence in 1981. Jamaica too has frequently experienced this phenomenon, as the table shows, and quite apart from the unusual circumstance that led to the PNP boycott of the 1983 elections, Jamaica has witnessed this development at least 6 times since independence, with 1993 manifesting the greatest electoral gulf between the 2 protagonists. So clearly that is of some concern. Now, there are other trends which have exhibited, and Tennyson, Joseph, and myself have written on this, which is the opposite tendency, where governments are thrown out and kept in office for just a single term. However, the worrying issue is the exclusion and the marginalization of opposition parties in government. So what we are saying is that There is, in fact, serious representational distortion in the Caribbean, and the question is, to what extent can we call what we have there for truly representative democracy, given that marginalization and that exclusion? And I'm also, of course, very much concerned with the fact that we have the possibility, and it has taken place, for a party to win the government on a substantially less than the majority vote. Yet, despite the fact that it appears that party competition is not unduly uncompetitive, given the electoral system in place, losing political parties are sometimes totally, as I said before, excluded, or at best are marginally represented. Now, this has unintended constitutional consequences. And so, Lutchman noted, in the more extreme case of the virtual absence of a political opposition in Parliament, the constitutional requirement that there should be a leader of the opposition with clearly defined roles cannot be actualized, and consequently can expose the government to constitutional challenges. This exclusion has led to a situation where not only is opposition political voices stifled, but the composition of the Senate has been impacted, as only one party can be represented in this nominated chamber. I just almost got a heart attack because I saw a note there that said 3 minutes. Anyway, the exception to this is where the Governor General or President has the power to appoint independent senators, thereby providing the opportunity for dissent and critical input into the political system to continue in the absence of the formal presence of the political opposition. So what is the way forward given that tendency that I spoke about a while ago? Clearly the issues that arise is the extent to which the voters of all the votes of all electors carry equal weight, and the manner in which the vote informs the composition of Parliament. And without going into what some people have said, in terms of the first past the post system, I want to make the point that when we look at the Caribbean, several Caribbean countries have in fact appointed reform commissions or review commissions to consider what changes can be done, can take place. And they have considered the efficacy of the model, although the majority of them have in fact lamented on its limitations, and they wrestle with the possibility of replacing the electoral system. Nevertheless, when you look at the various commission, the reports, and there are several, especially in the last 15 years or so, they have nearly all failed to recommend change. And I'm arguing that one of the primary reasons for this attachment to the model is its ability to produce a close relationship between parliamentarians and residents of the geographic district they represent. And so, quite apart from the opportunities provided to constituents to seek assistance from the directly elected representatives, which we heard about this morning, the direct election of the representative also provides them with the ability to hold a parliamentary and constituency representatives accountable for the actions of the parliamentary term. And I say that tongue-in-cheek. Moreover, the system has also invariably produced strong governments, and that is one of the reasons why we are so attached to it. Although in some jurisdictions, again, namely Trinidad and Tobago and St. Kitts Nevis, they have also experienced balanced parliaments, and so we have the phenomena of the hung parliaments. In others, for example, St. Lucia in 1987, Belize in 1989, and Barbados in 2013, the result of the general elections led to a government operating on a very slim majority, which has consequences for governmental stability. In the case of St. Lucia, one opposition member of parliament crossed the floor to strengthen the John Compton-led United Workers' Party government, which had secured 9 of the 17 parliamentary seats. Having secured 15 of 28 parliamentary seats in 1989 elections in Belize, the People's United Party succeeded in enticing a member of the United Democratic Party to cross the floor. So we do have those issues. And so I come to, if you look at the Constitution Reform Report in St. Kitts Nevis, for instance, and it's a 4-volume report on constitutional reform, it is silent on the issue of change of the model, although they recognize some of the difficulties of the model. So in contrast to the absence of any recommendations of that report in St. Kitts and Nevis, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and St. Lucia, a great deal of attention was in fact paid to the electoral system. Now, I think that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I'm summarizing because I've been told I have 2 minutes, St. Vincent and the Grenadines went much further than, in fact, St. Lucia in relation to constitutional reform. And if you look, for instance, and I found therefore the St. Lucia constitutional reform process, and by the way, remember I'm an insider, I was actually a member of the commission. In terms of the final recommendation, it seemed to me that we're extremely conservative in terms of the recommendation that we made, having recognized the difficulties that are experienced in St. Lucia. If you look at the 2011 report, therefore, it shows why the Commission considered the introduction of proportionality. It was nevertheless, it nevertheless was, and I quote, this is a quotation from the report, troubled by the possibility that given the historical closeness in the national vote, support of the two dominant political parties in the country, its adoption as an institutional system for St. Lucia could lead to deadlock in the Parliament, create excessive control by party bosses, and had the potential to create instability. Therefore, the Commission, that is in its own words, reasoned that the post-election bargaining and horse trading which takes place under the proportional representation system would be avoided by the retention of the status quo. So they rejected, of course, proportional representation, but and I'm saying that they are very conservative in relation to that. But again, in the interest of time, let me just state that in terms of the recommendation, I'm suggesting that because of the attachment to the first past the post system, a case can be made for its retention. But I'm also saying that we need to improve the overall quality of representation. Therefore, what we can do is to adopt a mixed system, what we call a mixed member majoritarian system, which marries the plurality system with the list system, so that it will in fact result in a number of changes in the countries in the Caribbean. First of all, it will improve the size of the Caribbean parliaments, give us an opportunity to have more committees that could participate in the deliberation. It will also provide an avenue where, if we're talking about a top-up list, the alternate list as against the nominal list, it would provide opportunities for more women to get involved in politics, because again, where the Caribbean is concerned, and again, if I look at the various Constitutional Reform Commission reports, they're very opposed to the idea of quotas for women, and they're very opposed to doing anything positive in relation to women. So I'm saying the top-up list, in terms of the non-nominal list, would provide those avenues, and it would also increase the size of the parliaments. I know I've run out of time, but I'm just begging the indulgence of the chair for 2 minutes more, if I may. Trevor is going to take 20, but Clifford is going to take 15. So I'm going to take 2 of Clifford's 15 minutes. He normally takes less time than he needs. So I'm saying, moving beyond electoral democracy, we need to reform our parliament. And again, for obvious reasons, my reference point is from the recommendations of the Constitutional Reform Commission of St. Lucia. And the reason I'm looking at it is not because I want to push the ideas which are there because I was part of the process, but because people like Paul Sutton, who have read the report, which was leaked, unfortunately, online before it went into Parliament, and it hasn't gotten into Parliament yet, and that was since 2011. It was leaked even before we had the final document. Paul Sutton actually notes that the constitution reform process in St. Lucia is extremely long in the making, and therefore the report itself is a reflection of the, and I quote, the thoroughness of the report and the intensive and extensive process of research, public information, and public consultation it involved. One of the flagship recommendations of the report was the idea that we reform the parliament by way of not establishing a clear separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch of government, but rather because we did not want to borrow an alien model like the Washington model, which was so discussed in St. Lucia, but instead what we did at the level of the Commission was to borrow from the French model in a way which would separate the elected members of the legislative branch of government from the executive, asking that they resign their post as a member of the legislative branch should the Prime Minister appoint them to the executive branch. So the only 2 people who would remain in the legislative branch of government who were elected would in fact be the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. Everybody else would have to resign, or alternatively the Prime Minister would choose people from outside to sit in the legislative branch of government. I have to tell you, it was very contentious, and of course people nearly came to blows. By the end of the day, most people accepted that. So I'll just conclude by saying that whereas several elements of West Indian constitutions are easy targets for criticisms, none more so than the electoral system and nature of the parliamentary relationship to the executive branch, it is regrettable that the national support, it is regrettable that the national support of political parties is not necessarily translated into accurate and acceptable levels of political representation. But the commissions have in fact failed to deal with this issue. So the proposal of the hybrid political form would result in greater checks and balances, an enhanced legislature, and greater accountability of the executive. And so I'm arguing my proposals on the mixed member majoritarian electoral model And the hybrid model would in fact provide a solution, a partial solution to the many problems of Westminster, and they can in combination certainly reduce the probability of continuing difficulties in our system of governance. Thank you.
Chairman, let me first congratulate Brian and Kate for bringing together this conference and the very important subjects that we are discussing and that no doubt we'll be confronting later on this evening when keynote speaker Gonzalez addresses us. In speaking to the question of individual ministerial responsibility, myth or reality, the Jamaican case, I'd like to divide my thoughts into 4 parts. First of all, the meaning of individual ministerial responsibility in the Westminster model itself, thoughts on how far that is a myth or reality at Westminster itself, and related to that, the attitudes of the British public to this aspect of political accountability. Secondly, and more broadly and globally, and perhaps the most important part of what I have to say, is the growing public distrust and declining levels of confidence in politics, whatever the model, whichever the country. Thirdly, 4 recent Jamaican cases of ministers resigning and reflections on the circumstances which make individual ministerial responsibility real or mythical in the Jamaican context. And finally, I will comment on an important implication of my analysis. First, the meaning of the term. A recent parliamentary committee in Australia provides an authoritative definition, and here I quote, "The doctrine of individual ministerial responsibility is central to the Westminster parliamentary system. In general terms, the doctrine states that ministers are individually responsible to the Parliament for actions taken under their authority. In particular, this relates to the actions taken by the portfolio department and agencies for which they are responsible. In the event of departmental error," the committee continued, "the principle requires that the minister accepts responsibility for the mistake and, if possible, corrects it. If the departmental failure is sufficiently serious, the minister should resign." End of quotes. Nevertheless, as you will immediately recognize, as a convention, this principle is a non-legal rule or practice which is not authoritatively codified in any document, and most of all cannot be enforced by legal means, as opposed to political sanctions. As a convention, therefore, it may be ignored, modified, or reinterpreted. 2 further points on the definition of this principle at Westminster. The Nolan Committee in 1995 introduced the element of ministers' responsibility for their personal conduct, not just their public official responsibilities. And Brazier, in commenting on this, put it this way: personal conduct in this sense can give rise to issues of ministerial responsibility. Secondly, ministers have a duty to Parliament to account for and to be held to account for the policies, decisions, and actions of their departments and agencies. The House of Commons resolution in 1997. Data on the application of this convention in the United Kingdom indicates the following, and is of some interest. The percentage of cabinet ministers who resign as a result of the application of this principle is relatively small. 11% as a percentage of those whose resignations were called for under Prime Minister John Major, 16% under Tony Blair. However, interestingly, the percentage of non-cabinet ministers who resigned on this basis is much higher, 71% under Major and 31% under Blair. Interestingly as well, at Westminster, ministerial resignations in recent decades have been due to personal rather than policy failings, commonly sexual misconduct or financial impropriety. A connected and important dimension of this issue is the British public's perception of the extent to which Parliament holds governments to account. 66% do not believe that Parliament holds governments to account, according to the Hansard Society's 2014 audit of public engagement just completed. This is the lowest level in the 5 years since this question has been asked, which leads me to the second part of my presentation, the issue of levels of confidence, public confidence in politics, whatever the model. In the United Kingdom, so-called home of Westminster, 14%, 14% of the people feel they have some influence over national decisions. And 55% do not believe that politicians go into politics to make a difference in their community. One scholar, Stoker, in 2011, concludes that data, and here I'm quoting, put nearly 2/3 of the British population in the anti-politics camp. And I want to underline the notion of the anti-politics camp, because I believe that this is not a British phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon that we need to confront. In the US, according to the September 2014 Gallup poll, 14%, 1/4, of Americans approve of how Congress is handling its job, one of the lowest Gallup poll measurements before a midterm election in 40 years, since 1974. In April 2010, 22% of Americans said they can trust the government in Washington, almost always or most of the time, among the lowest measures in half a century, according to the Pew Research Center. In Europe, 2011, 24% of the electorate across European states expressed trust in their government, and 27% in their national parliament, according to the Eurobarometer of December 2011. In Jamaica in 2012, on a scale of 0 to 100, trust in parliament was 45 points, in political parties 40. The latter, political parties, the least trusted among 12 institutions measured on the scale of trust, including the police. And that's the Latin American Public Opinion Project of 2012. You can see the tables there yourselves. My point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that distrust and lack of confidence is pervasive across all models, regardless of the conventions, Westminster, European parliamentary, or presidential. I suggest a main reason for this relates not so much to the design of political institutions, and here I'm attacking much of my own public scholarship, as to the structure of the prevailing dominant political economy, in which political authority is increasingly subject to largely unaccountable financial elites. National populations are, to one degree or another, discerning this reality. This is not a reality discerned by intellectuals. One indicator, the Global Corruption Barometer 2013, surveying 114,000 persons across 107 countries, found, and here I quote, that 54% of people think that the government is either largely or entirely captured by self-interest groups rather than being run for the benefit of the public at large. End of quotes. 60% in the United Kingdom, to break out those numbers a bit, 64% in the United States, and very indicatively, 83% in Greece, where the obvious capture of the state by the financial elite was most evident. In Jamaica, it's 54%, according to that particular study. Across 51 countries of these 107, vastly varying in levels of economic development, in structures, federal and unitary, in political models, Westminster, European parliamentary or presidential, political parties scored the highest amongst a range of institutions on perceived levels of corruption. That's the Global Corruption Barometer of 2013. I suggest that a main element, not by any means the only factor, underlying these perceptions is a reality dramatize, but not beginning with, the global economic crisis of 2008. Political structures, ladies and gentlemen, legislatures and cabinets elected by the people, particularly in the critical areas of regulatory oversight and fiscal policy, are increasingly subject to the dictates of the biggest creditors, the strongest banks, and the most influential financial elites. And we need not ask the question, who elected them? This does not mean that there is no value in examining the component parts of each model, the model itself and how its elements are functioning or malfunctioning. But what it does mean is that this examination has to be set in the general context of limited accountability, regardless of the model, to the mass public. This leads me to the Jamaican case of individual ministerial responsibility. It is generally accepted that in the Westminster model there are 4 options to give effect to the requirement of individual ministerial responsibility. 1, inform and explain to Parliament the alleged failing. 2, to apologize for the error. 3, to take action to correct the unsatisfactory state of affairs. And 4, resign. We examined 4 cases of resignation between 2006 and 2013. 1, Colin Campbell, Minister of Information and Development, October 8, 2006, in relation to the Trafigura affair and the controversy over whether $31 million payment was a gift to the People's National Party or an improper payment by a firm contracted by the government. And we're happy to see that the gentleman who raised that issue initially is sitting in the front row, former Prime Minister Bruce Golding. Secondly, Joseph Hibbert, State Minister for Transport and Works, July 14, 2009, and he resigned in relation to allegations of bribery by the United Kingdom bridge building firm Mabey and Johnson. Again, he resigned after a conversation with then Prime Minister Golding. Colin Campbell resigned after meeting with Prime Minister Simpson Miller. Mike Henry, Minister of Transport and Works, in relation to impropriety in the administration of Jamaican Development Infrastructure Program, JDIP, in November 29, 2011. And fourthly, Richard Azan, Minister of State, Minister of Transport, Works and Housing, in relation to the irregularities in the award of contracts and the erection of shops at the Spalding Market in Christiana. Azan resigned on September 2013, but lo and behold, was reinstated on November 14, 2013. These resignations, it should be noted, occurred in a context in which Ministry Paper number 19 of 2002, tabled by then Prime Minister Patterson, outlined principles governing the conduct of ministers to which all members of government are expected to adhere, in the words of the Ministry Paper. This document essentially reproduces the standards in public life laid out in the United Kingdom's Nolan Report. The 7 principles of public life included: 1, integrity, holders of public office not placing themselves under any financial or other obligation to outside individuals or organizations that might influence them in performance of their official duties. 2, objectivity, in carrying out public business, including making public appointments, awarding contracts, or recommending individuals for rewards and benefits. Holders of public office should make choices on merit. And thirdly, leadership. Holders of public office should promote and support these principles by leadership and example. Time does not permit going into the details of the circumstances relating to each of these 4 resignations since 2006. However, we can infer that in Jamaica, resignation as an option in respect of individual ministerial responsibility is likely to be a reality when there is a convergence of 4 factors, and likely to be a myth when those convergences do not occur. Number 1, the findings of independent bodies, such as the Office of the Contractor General or the Auditor General. Number 2, strong public disapproval through the media and by civil society organizations of the minister's continued incumbency. 3, sustained demands by the parliamentary opposition, and 4, the judgment by the Prime Minister that the minister's departure is an appropriate application of the convention and or expedient for reducing political fallout. Amongst these 4 factors, colleagues, the last, in my opinion, is the most decisive in Jamaican conditions, and perhaps no different from many other places. To this extent, Jamaican experience coincides to some degree with what Brazier, his assessment of the UK itself. And here I quote, "The attitude of the Prime Minister is pivotal. Although not even the most ruthless defense of a colleague by the Prime Minister will necessarily save him from loss of office, especially if the Cabinet or the parliamentary party or the minister's constituency or the media turn against him," end of quotes. It follows from this analysis that in Jamaica, individual ministerial responsibility is both a myth and a reality, the determining and overriding factor being whether the Prime Minister supports or withdraws support from the minister. And we will not have time to go into the number of occasions when the 3 factors exist, but the Prime Minister retains support for the particular minister, and individual ministerial responsibility in those circumstances becomes a myth. The minister continues. The main implication of this, in conclusion, is for more, not less robust intervention, investigation, and advocacy on the part of independent authorities, civil society, the media, and the parliamentary opposition in the context of grave breaches of standards as set out in Ministry Paper number 19, and the extent to which that is a requirement if the system is to have even the minimum level of accountability in respect of ministers. My more overarching conclusion, however, is that strengthening accountability in respect of this component still leaves us with the intellectual and policy challenge of how to rescue the elected institutions of governance from the stranglehold increasingly evident of non-elected institutions, particularly the financial elite, the creditors, and those who speak through the International Monetary Fund. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I'm happy to be here again, and thanks Kate and Brian, and other colleagues who were in London a year ago. And let me reprimand my colleague Cynthia, who, just like last year, used up my time. Thank you, Trevor. We men have to stick together. So last year I looked at, for the conference, at structure, and I looked at political reform, constitutional reform in the British Virgin Islands, where they have introduced an at-large system on top of the existing first-past-the-post system. And I looked at that in the context of other constitutional arrangements in the region, where you have, like St. Kitts and Nevis, long-standing animus between the 2 islands, and there's the multi-island states of Trinidad and Tobago and so on. And we know, of course, that while in general we talk about Westminster in the Caribbean, there are these peculiarities from country to country based on geography, which is an essential component of the story I want to tell this afternoon. Both Cynthia and Trevor, and earlier the minister this morning, have spoken to some of the substance that I want to get at, and so I'll try not to repeat much of what they've said. But the focus of my presentation is on the relationship between accountability and performance, which is supposed to be the essence of the Westminster system. And I thought that if we really want to analyze and evaluate the effectiveness of the system, one of the questions we must ask is, how effective has the system been? how effective has it been in the area of accountability, and of course in the area of delivery of services and providing for security. And that's really the context of the paper that I'm working on. So this is just essentially a work in progress. As I was preparing, doing some research, I came across a very interesting quote by Walter Bagehot, in which he says, quote, "An ancient and ever-altering constitution is like an old man who still wears with attached fondness clothes of the fashion of his youth. What you see of him is the same. What you do not see is wholly altered." And I was listening this morning, I thought that this quote sort of rang and rings true to the conversations we're trying to have here about the system. So, let me get my page here. And another article by Pippa Norris of Harvard speaks to this phenomenon. In 2001, quote, "With very few exceptions, including Barbados, which continue to, quote, cling to this ideal as nostalgically as John Major's images of cricket whites, British bobbies, and warm beer," unquote, "we are perhaps witnessing the twilight of the pure Westminster model." No contradiction here to what Hamid said earlier today. This is really a contested idea. So for me, then, what I'm trying to develop in this paper is to understand the whole process of the system throughout the region. And I thought that structurally this ought to be divided into two phases. I've argued in earlier work that the Caribbean system, Anglophone system, has been successful with the Westminster derived model. And this was almost 20 years ago. And so I went back and I reread that work, and I was asking myself, did I really write this? Did I believe this? Because in the context of contemporary events, I'm now beginning to contest those very ideas that I've written. And that is because much has changed. And I think what that means then is that I really need to look at this in phases. And it seems to me that it's rather true that during the first phase of constitutional, of democratic development in the Caribbean, which I call the Cold War phase, certainly up to the late 70s and early 80s, when development took place in the region based on this competition and contestation over political and economic rivalry between the Soviet Union on the one hand, the Americans on the other. And so the region benefited from the largest that they were able to draw from either of both of these powers. And so the United States was willing to support a statist model of dependent development that provided the United States and the United Kingdom, that provided grants in aid, among other things, and that provided governments with the largest from which they could use to provide political patronage under the clientelist model, with which most of us are familiar. But that phenomenon began to change, certainly with the Arab oil crisis of the 1970s, and of course, Manley's venture into, or excursion, I suppose, into democratic socialism in Jamaica, the Grenada Revolution in 1979 to 83, and certainly cooperative socialism in Guyana. And there was a pushback by the West, specifically the United States. And as a consequence, we began to see less support for the statist model and more of an emphasis on the neoliberal model of development with its attendant structural adjustment programs and so on. So my contention then is that we should examine, which is what I'm trying to do, the phenomenon of democratic development in the region in two phases. What was it like, and what were the institutions and processes and resources that were used to support this model and give it its vibrancy that enabled large numbers of people in the region to enjoy significant levels of social mobilization, high levels of educational attainment, and so on, and how that process seemed to have been attenuated in the post-Cold War world as a result of the shift away from the statist model of development to more of one that focuses on market-orientated neoliberalist models. And I think that then gives us a metric by which we can assess and evaluate the whole notion of accountability and effectiveness of governance. And in that sense, I think what Trevor presented just now in terms of the ministerial component rings very true, because I was thinking about what happened in 1989 in Antigua under this very model, when the general elections were won by the Antigua Labour Party, and there were 17 seats that were being contested in Parliament. And the ALP won 15 of those seats and subsequently appointed 11 of those winners as ministers. Do you need 11 ministers in government of in the parliament in a winning coalition, a winning party of 15? That was the first question. But it turned out, and this was referred to again this morning, the whole corruption factor. It turned out that it was not sufficient to win your seat in Antigua. You had to become a minister, because ministerial positions give you access to resources. And beyond delivering roads and schools and other social benefits to your constituency, support came from what you could do for the constituents on an individual basis. Can you get my son or daughter into high school? Can you get him a job? It became much more personal. And so, so as I was listening to Trevor, I see the connection with this whole question of accountability and effectiveness of government. The other aspect of this that I want to point out is that we cannot and should not look at the role of Westminster in the region purely from an internal perspective, because there is the international community in which all of this is unfolding. It is no surprise, and we all are aware, that many of the problems that occurred in Jamaica in the 1970s had the hand of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the American government behind it. And so if you did not toe the line in a certain way, you did not get access to resources for development. But that said, the other important aspect of this is the region's geography. I heard another reference to that this morning, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We are located in what's considered to be the Caribbean corridor. We're located proximate between the producing drug countries of South America and the consumption countries of North America. Geography binds us here. We cannot move. Geography also, our geography makes us small. Our geography has not endowed us with significant amounts of natural resources. And as a consequence, we are highly dependent on an international system over which we have very little control. Which then begs the question to me, what is where and how do leaders in these countries generate the resources to provide for the goods and services that their citizens are demanding of them? It is no surprise that the 2013 report indicated that there were at least 3 or maybe 4 countries in the Caribbean, certainly the common Caribbean, that were among the top 10 highly indebted countries in the world. And so my approach to this question about efficacy looks at what appears to be a kind of unholy relationship between the political structure, political parties in the political system, and what I consider to be uncivil society groups that have been part and parcel of the process early on, but now not having access to resources or client clientelist resources from government have found and forged their own semi-autonomous, quasi-autonomous modes of providing for themselves and filling up some of the spaces that the government is unable to fill. And part of this is being done through the linkages to international organized crime, particularly drug trafficking. And so when I look across the region from Jamaica to Trinidad, even down to St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua, I see a pattern in which the system, the political system that we've inherited from Westminster is in sometimes closely, sometimes, other times not so closely linked to criminal drug trafficking organizations that have managed to capture some political space within each of these countries, and in the process seem to be shackling the system in functioning in a way that is that provides for probity and accountability and effective governance. So my contention in this presentation as I develop this paper is that the challenge, the most serious challenge that I see for the survival of the Westminster model has to do with this social contract that seems to have been made between organized gang activity, some of which have been brought out of the darkness and being crowned as community organizations led by community leaders. And in the case of Trinidad, for example, they compete and contest for the largest from the government. The latest of which is the life sport program, in which tens of millions of dollars are being used to fund operations in some of these inner city communities. It's a successor to the unemployment relief program. And we find a number of these patterns across the region. And so what I'm suggesting here then is that the issue of accountability and performance have to be, those issues have to be analyzed within the context of the ability or lack thereof of these countries to continue to provide the kinds of goods and services that are to be demanded of them by their citizens in an environment in which governments have become weak because they don't have access to the kinds of capital that they once had, that is certainly during the Cold War period. And now with social media, access to internet, and citizens having this, I guess, inflated desire to emulate the rest of the world. We only we only click away from the United States in terms of taste and style and pattern. I remember this morning the Honorable Prime Minister of St. Vincent was remarking that he came to Jamaica and he saw all these automobiles at $100,000 and so on. Well, I'm sure they're in. Sorry? Oh, okay. Oh, 5 minutes. Yeah. Okay, so so where am I going with this? I'm trying to understand and explain, trying to figure out, sorry, one, whether the problem here lies with the system of governance that we have inherited, or whether it has anything to do with the fact that we are, by virtue of our history and our geography, located where we are and subjected to international forces over which we have little or no control, particularly the vast power of international drug trafficking organizations, organized crime entities, that directly and indirectly have managed to penetrate our security services, our political officials, and in the process are effectively undermining what seemed to have been, for certainly the first part of our experience as independent countries, solid, robust, open, and responsive political systems. If the emphasis, and since the emphasis seems to be on rugged individualism, and there is this increasing desire to not only to acquire things such as expensive automobiles and take trips and live like the rest of the world with which we're familiar through our television stations and so on. And in the absence of resources, and in the absence of the ability of the countries in which we live to provide those opportunities, it seems to me that while the systems are in place, the power of the state has been emasculated by the vast pressure that is being placed on our societies by the demands for illegal narcotics that are coming from North America and Europe, the production processes that are coming, that drive these from the South, and our own geography that prevents us from doing anything about it, because we don't have the capacity in terms of the Coast Guard services, the security services to combat and confront these powerful entities. So this is a work in progress. I have not come up with a way of teasing out what a possible solution ought to be. I hypothesize, however, that, and in this regard, I agree with what others have said before, including Trevor, that, and certainly the minister this morning, the issue of corruption is central to all of this. And corruption it's a human phenomenon. And the question is whether or not there is anything that we can do within the political sphere to hold our elected officials more accountable. What can we do? Is there anything that we can do to encourage them to resist the temptations that they're confronted with when provided with huge sums of money to allow $700 million worth of cocaine to be put into cans of orange juice and transshipped from one Caribbean country to a destination someplace else. It is clear from where I'm standing that the ordinary hustlers in the street do not have the capital to undertake this kind of enterprise. So it begs the question as to the locus, who is allowing and how is this being allowed to take place? And in posing this question, then, to me, it gets at the essence of part of what we're interrogating. My time is up. Are we inquiring about the form of governance or the substance of governance? We have inherited the structures. We have undertaken a number of processes, but in terms of the system's ability to deliver and to be accountable, to me that still remains an open question, and I end there. Right on time.
Thank you. Let me thank the panelists for their papers and the issues that they have raised in this first session dealing with Westminster in practice. Let me open for questions, brief comments. Dr. Peter John Gordon from the Department of Economics.
Yes. The question of Westminster in the Caribbean, it seems that a central part of that issue is, does size matter? And it clearly does. It would be interesting to know of the 126 candidates who will run for the major party in the next election in Jamaica, how many of them truly are running for Member of Parliament, or how many of them are truly running for Cabinet Minister? and especially when the skill sets required are very different. And Trevor, the question of ministerial responsibility as against collective cabinet responsibility, I'd like to hear you a little bit more on that. And one last comment before I sit down, Trevor. There are lots of people who want to exercise political power without facing the electorate, including civil society.
My question actually.
Could you introduce yourself?
Because I'm this Caden my question actually emerged when I heard Griffin speak, and he raised the question of geography. And I think you use geography in a very negative way. And I heard the question asked about size. But the first thing that struck me was, and it's a question that can go to both Cynthia and you, Griffin. To what extent are our reviews kind of mechanical and detached from our material reality? But I would think, for example, that small size review is asking questions about, can they not advance democracy? Yeah. Can the small size not allow for greater ministerial accountability and so forth? Are there advantages in small size that we don't get captured in the British system, which we claim we're inheriting? So for the people who have some commissions, to what extent have your deliberations coming from that angle, as opposed to broad theoretical discussions about democracy and corruption and so on? Perhaps we should start from the ground up and perhaps to get new and innovative questions that have nothing to do with big philosophy about democracy, but actual our material reality, which can perhaps give you some of the answers that you're looking for in terms of the relationship between accountability and the other issue that you and effectiveness that you will explore. Thank you.
Horace Matthews from the Rastafari Unity Council. I have listened intently from this morning, and we are looking towards this Westminster model as the only model that we can operate governance from. Rastafari has put forward a theocratic government theory on a number of occasions. Now, the first form of governance we get from the Bible, the Testament, the 10 commandments from the Bible. That's the foundation. When man make laws and deviate from the laws of God, then you find confusion reigning. As we have tried so many different models and it has not worked, it is not working and it will not work because man is inherently corrupt under these systems. We have to go towards a theocratic government.
Professor Sir Oje.
I want to add a qualifying word to the question of size. And it is small size of what? Small size of population contains within it an inherent tendency towards corruption. Everybody knows everybody else. And they say no more.
It was funny, the size thing turned up at the same Montego Bay conference, in which Bustamante said, these small islands, their total revenue is less than the Kingston St. Andrew Council. At which point Rupert rose and said, well, per capita, in fact, Antiguans are richer than Jamaicans. But I'm not sure that small size necessarily leads to corruption. If you look at Britain today, or the United States, you have some very large countries in which there's a full capture of the state by elite interests, without the need for there to be a very small size. But I just want to kind of these were just offhand remarks, but specifically to this panel, I think we need to distinguish between when we talk about Westminster, whether we're talking about a system of representation, or whether we're talking about a system of administration. And I'm finding that our discussions today are allowing these two particular themes to become muddy. The question of representation, we need to bear in mind that the Westminster system, for much of its history, never pretended to fully represent everyone in the territories which he operated. In a very famous declaration in the 18th century, Bishop Whately said, none are actually represented, all are virtually represented. And the principle of the Westminster system is to represent the elements and constituencies within the nation, not necessarily everybody in the nation. And that's an important thing to grasp. We may not agree with this, but that's at least the core of the model. In terms of administration, we have a much more complicated thing to think about, because the history of the state in the Caribbean is one of actually being extremely small for most of its history. The colonial government was never willing to tax the planters at the level which would have made possible a large state which penetrated society in a profound way. So all of the states in the Caribbean were fairly small. They had limited effect. The governors had enormous powers, but actually the states did very little. And one of the attempts of governments from the 1930s onwards, side by side with the sort of the emergence of the welfarist model in the West, is to create states that could do more. And the question has always been, what would be the basic economic basis of this expanded state? How is it to be paid for? And we run into, therefore, to a whole question really having to do with the kind of history of what exactly do you mean by administration? What are the purposes of administration? And again, what kinds of connections can you make with representation or not?
Okay, before the next person comes, can I ask the panel if they want to hear all questions or take a break now? Respond? Take a break now. Take a break now? Okay. Let us take all the questions and then we just break them down into their respective parts.
My name is David. I'm a student at SALISES. It seems apparent to me, listening to all the presenters today, that the Caribbean intelligentsia has identified or recognized for quite some time the shortcomings of the Westminster model. However, there seems to be no real progress with regards to actual reformation. My question is whether or not, to the entire panel, the Caribbean population is sufficiently educated pertaining to these shortcomings, whether or not there is enough advocacy coming from Caribbean intelligentsia, and specifically, is there the political will to actually make these changes? Or does the system, the Westminster model, actually perpetuate the very power and corruption that you would have identified?
Hamid Ghani, University of Western St. Augustine. This question is to Professor Munroe. I was intrigued by your presentation on individual ministerial responsibility, and I just wondered the extent to which you may recalibrate some of your thinking in respect of the office of the Prime Minister. Seeing that the Prime Minister is also an individual minister, and how would you treat with prime ministerial resignation in the context of some of the controversies you've outlined, and how would your theory encompass a Prime Minister who steps down in circumstances such as you have defined using some of the principles you have? Because you did say that the Prime Minister was critical in respect of other ministers. How would you treat in respect of the Prime Minister himself when the Prime Minister steps down?
I just want a quick comment. First on corruption, and one of the speakers spoke about the long road of history. You know, when I went to school, I heard about how the Dutch came and the Dutch were serious in mercantile exploitation. So my question is, if we read history, is it that we will discover that anybody that gets anything from the Dutch is from their Caribbean? That's just a question I'm throwing out there, because if you get something back from the Dutch now, is it reparation or whatever? Just throwing that out as a quick question. The other thing that came up was about us having Benzes and looking well. But is that just a part of the Westminster model where, just like how the British have this program called Keeping Up Appearances? Is it that in our Caribbean nation, what we have is that we are pretty poor? The other question to Professor Munroe, as I spoke with him after, was the level of questioning the integrity at all levels. When we have a system like GSAT, where people make a lot of money for private lessons. At what point do we make those persons also accountable? I think I can find a Prime Minister in Jamaica and write a letter to, and I can say, without exception, I've gotten a response. How do we deal with that level? We had a child advocate coming out to say that children are being abused, but that's not really the abuse. No parent seems to be able to break that hole throughout the entire system where chunks of money are being spent on books, extra lessons, and the children may fail or could fail because they're not participating in that level. And those are people to people. I'm not talking about the abuse of the police, which again, we have the police is bad, so we can usually get after them. There's an issue that came up in the newspaper about the churches. Churches have women in there and they're volunteers, they're unpaid. What obligation does a church have to their constituents? Is it something that Professor Munroe can take on? I know he has taken whips for the workers in the past, and so maybe his back is broad to deal with. No, seriously, to deal with the country. I mean, as I said, we're going to come out against the politicians and the police and so on, but I think there's a time in the Caribbean for everybody to be held. Thank you.
Percy Henson, Florida International University. I'd like to follow up on Professor Richard Drayton's intervention. He said that a distinction needs to be made between representation and administration. I think we need to add to that participation. Because if you have effective participation, then representation and administration would very well be effective. And I think there's a fundamental distinction between representative government, representative democracy, and participatory democracy. And we need to begin to sort of talk about that.
Tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for questions and comments. Can I ask Cynthia to lead off?
Okay, I'm just briefly, I want to, I think, just treat the issue of size, which came up in a number of people. I'm not sure if I agree with Emerson that, and Patsy, I was referring before, that size will in fact create the necessary levels of accountability in our income model. There doesn't seem to be any evidence. And in fact, Person, I've heard you before speak on the issue of size, and you certainly have said that in relation to Caribbean countries, because we're so small, because we all know each other, it has created in some parts of the Caribbean, certainly in the location where we are in Barbados, a culture of silencing of individuals. And that's one of the dangers, as far as I'm concerned, with respect to the issue of accountability. And there's a lot of fear that has been generated on the part of not only ordinary people, of academics themselves. You know that they speak about academics, don't even want to speak within the institution of the University of the West Indies itself for fear of being shut down by those in authority. And journalists have spoken about the constant bombardment of the person by politicians if they dare to speak. Now, in terms of my approach, clearly this might be a limited approach because I approach it from the point of view of institutionalism. And the bottom line is that we have very tiny parliaments. All of the parliaments, a lot of the parliaments in the Caribbean, the entire, the cabinet is made up almost of the entire parliament. So it does not leave really much scope for you to engender any accountability, which is why I'm asking for a change in the model that we have that will enlarge the parliament a little more than it currently is, and divorcing the cabinet from the legislative branch so that the kind of accountability we have not yet experienced can in fact evolve in the Caribbean. That's one of the things. I want to also make reference to the question we spoke about the level of, I think, citizen engagement in terms of the constitutional process, I think, coming from the student. Certainly in places like, as far as I'm aware, in St. Vincent and St. Lucia, there was some level of public participation in the process. And there were quite a number of public lectures and forums, etc., that we attended. That we went into secondary schools, we went into primary schools, we went to the workplace. Instead of asking people to come to us, the town hall meetings, because we found that particular method to be a very limited method. Because we would go to town hall meetings, and the truth is we would get 1 or 2 people, and there would be about 15 commissioners dealing with 2 or 3 people. So we found it really useless in a sense. So what we did is that we actually went to people, we went to the banks, we went to the schools, we went to businesses. Once they asked us to come to them, we went to them and we spoke. And we got quite a number of very useful suggestions coming out of people. People are very informed, but they also, in terms of, and the commission, I would say, also departed somewhat from some of the major recommendations coming out from the people. I think in its infinite wisdom, it thought that what people were suggesting perhaps would not be the best. Hamid Ghani may, in fact, also like to chip in here because Hamid was very, I think, close to the process in St. Lucia, and he received all of the material that we had because he was trying to do something where he was an advisor, I think, to the commission. But generally speaking, there are attempts to educate the public on a whole host of things. I know the academia in particular, certainly maybe not in Jamaica, but certainly in Barbados have been criticized for its lack of more engagement with the public, but an attempt certainly was made in St. Lucia. Now, one of the problems with the Grenadian approach, so I've been told, is that by Simeon McIntosh, is that they tried to have public engagement in the process, but unfortunately, they got very little coming out from the public. I do not know what that is symptomatic of, but clearly I don't think people find talking about the Constitution very interesting. And the question is how we sell it, so that in St. Lucia, we came up with some skits and some other things in the popular language in St. Lucia too, so that we could actually, invite and attract people to our various meetings. I don't know if Amin has anything to say.
Let me follow up on the issue of critical issue which I think have been posed. The programs of reform, one sort or another, programs of transformation have been talked about by the intelligentsia and by enlightened elements within the elite structures, whether civil society, political or private sector, for decades. And hence the issue arises as to why so much effort has produced so little in terms of reforms or transformation. It's a very complicated issue. I listened carefully to Peter Phillips this morning. One of his suggestions, I think, bears some further reflection. I certainly want to think about it some more. And that is the extent to which some of the forms are organic. Use that term. To what extent they're really growing out of generations of experience which undermine the notion of quote-unquote Westminster as a straight importation. I want to think about it. I don't have a conclusion on it. What I have a conclusion on is that awareness building and public education, as we have called it, in a context where the populations are preoccupied with making two ends meet, with survival, with getting a work, and all the other aspects of living on the margins. Awareness building is not 100 meters. It is a marathon, and if you don't have the fixity of purpose to stick with it through thick and thin, up and down, then regrettably, we're not going to get particularly far. And that sticking with it means not simply doing the town hall meetings, important as those are, making the presentations and doing the advertisements on television to the extent that you have that possibility. It also means a fairly sophisticated approach to building coalitions and alliances where there is a common convergence of interest. I think of yesterday's Gleaner headline, which tells us that the government has laid a bill in Parliament to register political parties. Now, just contemplate that for a moment. The political parties in Jamaica have the legal status of youth clubs. They have no statutory base, no statutory personality, unlike trade unions, unlike charitable organizations have to be registered and lodge their accounts. Political parties not so. That issue I raised in the Senate in 2002. Now it's 2014. The issue of campaign finance reform. These are issues which confront vested interests, first of all, and secondly, which do not immediately excite the man in the street, given his preoccupations and given the absence of explanation of the connection between the bad road, the absence of water supplies, and the other immediate necessities and the macro issues. every time I listen to my friend Richard Biles talk about the successes in passing the IMF tests, the revenue has fallen short, and because the revenue has fallen short, not least of all because of tax evasion, which we didn't have an opportunity to ask Peter about this morning, the expenditures have to be cut. Now, I would love to have an itemization in those monthly reports by EPOC as to where these expenditures are being cut, which hospitals, which clinics, which roads, which water supplies, so that the public will have a better understanding of the macro, this extraordinary success which brought Lagarde here, and the micro, which people are bawling about every day. We can't discern that in a presentation which says expenditure had to be cut to maintain the primary balance because revenue fell short. A great responsibility, therefore, rests, I agree with student, on the intellectual, on the intelligentsia, on the tradition of public scholarship, typified by somebody like Carl Stone of blessed memory, Norman Griffin, to be constantly explaining. And part of the reason why I think we do not do enough of it, and I raised this at the university, at the higher authorities in our campus some years ago, is that when assessments and promotions come up, and you look at the weighting of the different criteria for assessment and promotion, where does public awareness building fall? I suggest nowhere. If you produce a very good article, and I'm not hitting the good articles, the pure scholarship, the applied scholarship that 100 people may read in an abstract and abstruse journal, that gets big marks. You do a regular column which brings public scholarship to the awareness building of the people, that gets next to zero. And that is a main issue why so many of our young scholars in a highly competitive environment don't feel as motivated as they perhaps might be if our assessment and promotion system does not change in radical ways. A couple other quick points, if I may. Hamid's point about the Prime Minister. I'm sorry Bruce Golding left here, because he's a main example within recent times of a Prime Minister resigning. And that had to do with a confluence of factors, the three that I mentioned: parliamentary opposition, civil society, the media. But in this case, of course, when it comes to a Prime Minister, a lot depends on his political standing. And my impression is, subject to Bruce's confirmation or otherwise, that they would have done their polling. And therefore, in that context, the application of individual ministerial responsibility to the Prime Minister depends a lot on the feedback from the ground through scientific polling and what the parliamentary group around him thinks. If this is a liability, especially then if the international community, and particularly the hegemonic power in our area, weighs in one way or the other, then the Prime Minister goes. So it has a very specific application there, though in normal circumstances, the PM is a determining factor in how far individual responsibility is recognized. The final point on participatory democracy. Again, a long-distance race, and we've seen where, serious errors were made in that we didn't see participatory democracy as a deepening of and a development on representative democracy. Too much of it, I think, in our reflection on Grenada, we saw it as a replacement of rather than an extension and a deepening. And in that context, more study needs to be given of the one case in the Caribbean where the right of recall actually exists, and that is in Belize. How far since 2010 has it been used? I know there are two instances where the electorates have filed petitions, and there's a challenge in the courts. We need to look at that more carefully, because I'm this is a thing we have advocated from the 70s. It finally came in Belize. I know, as Hamid would tell you far more than I, the Trinidad and Tobago experiment of a hybrid system is of great, great interest. Quite apart from the political dynamics and the ethnic elements which come into the actual proposals being made to separate the executive from the legislative arm. The proportional representation, which I believe is part of your proposals for the Senate, and the right of recall It's a very comprehensive package, which, whatever the motivations and whatever the political dynamics surrounding it, need, I think, to be studied more carefully by those of us who want to see a deepening of democracy in a more participatory way. I want to beg off on the theocratic model, Rupert.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, panelists, so far. I will give the final word to Clifford.
In the interest of time, let me just make one quick comment on the issue of size. So I'm one who also argued that size really matters, and in the case of the English-speaking Caribbean, this book. Oh, sorry. So I argue about the advantages of size when it comes to the Westminster model, and so I'm not antagonistic to that at all. I was using it more descriptively, and I take Richard's point, I take Percy's point about separating these, and in a way is what I'm seeking to do. I'm coming at it from a different perspective, and so this was using the size really was more descriptive. This is the way we are. We are small physically. We lack significant natural resources, etc., and we are also geographically located in a particular space, and that makes us then susceptible and vulnerable to forces that are sort of beyond our control. So, and I think that in and of itself is impacting in some ways on our ability to be accountable, to deliver in the kind of ways that reflect probity and transparency, and so it's something I'm exploring as from the sort of output, sort of substantive output perspective, rather than a critical analysis of whether the size can or be an impediment towards democracy.
Thank you very much, panel, and thank you, audience, for your comments and questions. We take a coffee break.